All right, so as I was saying, with regards to the side bends do operate as flexion. That's why we do those first. One of the reasons why we do those first. We're not just dogmatic, we have to understand why. And side bends are important because they actually create space on either side of the vertebra before going backwards. That way you're not simply compressing the vertebra into one another. So again, the reason why understanding ranges of motion is important from a teaching standpoint is so that you understand the order in which you place asana. So regardless of any injuries in the class, that's at least something fixed in your mind. You know that for your spine, you will always have some kind of side bend activity before a back bend, a forward bend, or a twisting. Right? For your legs and for your arms, and because we primarily work with shoulders and hips, you're always going to have some kind of, again, flexion and extension before we have abduction or adduction. And that's really to elongate those bigger, more superficial muscles before going to the more deeper muscles that set the body, and the stabilizers, if you will.
I have a question really quick.
Absolutely, go for it.
So when we start class with a traditional Surya Namaskar, is that enough of that sagittal plane movement to get you to start doing some more of that, begin an adduction?
The drawing ab, the pulling away.
Yeah. So because that's sometimes where I hang up. So like where I don't. Like I go through that and I feel like, was that enough that I can now start throwing in things that draw the legs apart at this point? Or do I still need to be focused on keeping the sagittal movement, legs, arms moving in that normal plane of motion?
This is actually a good question, and it really does depend. At that point, it depends more on the students, how tight they are, how beginner they are even, because if they haven't done a lot of yoga in the past, then their bodies may be a little less forgiving. I personally, and I know you and Emily had experiences my classes early on, after doing some very minimal warm-up, because it usually involves standing forward bends, which technically are already flexion of the legs, of the hips, I would start moving into Skandasana, or at least Skanda Vinyasa, after that. And I had a few students who were saying that their bodies didn't feel as prepared. And so I started adding longer sagittal sets prior to moving into the lateral sets, but then the lateral sets would end up taking up the majority of the middle and ending parts of class for that reason, because we hadn't done any of it in the beginning. But to answer your question, I think it can be done because technically you have prepared the body in that sagittal plane. You have had flexion, both with down dog and with standing forward fold. You have had extension with stepping back into low lunge, coming into cobra. So technically, you're prepared to start moving into the frontal plane at that point.
Does the same apply for twisting of the spine? Say if at the beginning of a class, I've actually been trying to construct like a very simple sequence to help prepare people just for like seated meditation. And I was trying to figure out if I'm doing like some side bending and a standing back bend or two to prepare their spine, can I then incorporate, say like with cactus arms, a twist, like just a standing gentle spinal twist? Does that prepare them enough to start twisting in that way? Absolutely.
If you've had a forward bend in there, because the forward bend is going to really elongate those erector spinae or spinae, the forward bend is going to be sufficient. And especially since you're doing a primarily active twist and you're not asking them to do an incredibly deep twist, like a seated Marichyasana, when you twist from a seated position. If you were doing that, you would want a little bit more preparation. But what you're describing, or even a twisted chair, would be fine that early on, as long as that other spinal work had been done. Yeah.
That's something I never thought about, is as long as the twist is something active earlier on, you're safer.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is an important thing too. When we're working into asana, which are closer to the ground, right? Stretching asana. The closer you move to the ground, usually, not always, but usually, almost 100% of the time, the asana are going to be deeper. They're going to be considered more maximum postures. And so we have to be more mindful about what we've done to prepare for that particular position. That's why, like Amanda and I have had this discussion. Ardha Hanuman better fits after a sufficient warm-up. Sometimes it gets tossed in there because yes, it is passive, so technically body weight and gravity do some of the work. But if we want our students to feel successful, if we want to feel successful, then a posture like that, because we are closer to the ground, you're not gonna have as much force of gravity doing the work for you. That's why we do pyramid more often than not toward the beginning of a class, and we do that Ardha Hanuman later on. Because pyramid, you're higher up, so you have more force of gravity moving you down. Makes it an easier pose to accomplish. Not easy.
So I had a quick question, Jessie.
Yes,
So
go for it, Neil.
when you do the, when you said before doing the Ardha Hanuman, you do the legs separated and the forward bend.
Mm-hmm.
Is it for a practitioner student who does not have, who's working with the hip flexibility?
Mm-hmm.
Is it better to stretch the legs far apart and get the head to the ground, or is it better to keep the legs closer and try to get the lift in the hip?
Okay, this is a really good question because I've actually played with this myself when practicing. And I feel it more if my head is above the ground and I'm really trying to fold as deeply between the legs as possible. This does present a challenge from a balance standpoint, however, because the head, if you really allow yourself to lean forward in that Prasarita Padottanasana, if you really allow yourself to lean forward, the head offers you a kind of like a fail-safe. You won't go all the way over in this case, because I have had students forward roll out of that pose. I mean, albeit they were super committed to it, and it didn't happen often. But still, you know, having the head closer to the ground does offer some support. But I do believe, just from a personal standpoint, keeping the feet a little closer together where the head can clear the ground is going to get deeper into those hamstrings.
Thanks.
And then if you want to get into the adductors, so the inner thighs, in that case, you're going to favor more the legs going apart, and you're not going to worry about the deep hip flexion. You're going to focus more on the feet just moving apart, but that's something different. You are stretching different muscles at that point. And this will come up too, you guys, and I don't have it in here, but you know, when we are talking about abduction, moving the legs away from midline, at least when we're talking about, you know, the hips, there are different kinds of abduction. It's not as simple as forward flexion. You know, forward flexion is forward flexion. Abduction can be joined with forward flexion. Abduction can be joined with external rotation. So when you're deciding what lateral moves that you want to start putting into class, that's another factor. So like with Amanda's question, when is it a good time to start moving the legs away from midline? It depends on what you're doing. If you're doing a skanda vinyasa, right, you're moving just side to side, and you're not going to your most deep expression of skandasana. So it looks like a half malasana on one side and the other leg is straight. Then you don't need as much warming up. But if you're going into like a very deep skandasana, because that straight leg is also in an external rotation, you've got to make sure your hamstrings are a little bit more warm for that. And that's why I typically won't do a skandasana until after I've done some kind of asymmetrical forward flexion of that leg, to at least give it, you know, some additional preparation for the hamstrings at the very least. Yeah.
So that's why it's in my mind when I think of like wide-legged forward fold.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for me, I feel like I can add that pretty early on, because if we've already done a forward fold with our feet beneath our hips and we turn halfway, we keep all 10 toes facing, it's still the same motion. It's just have now abducted the legs further away. So I don't feel like that's something that I have to wait for in the middle or towards the end of class. Does that make sense?
Makes total sense. And you're right too, because all you really have changed is you've moved the legs. That's it. You're not doing any rotations there. So that's not a bad thing. And as long as, and with that too, that goes back to the whole, you know, body weight and gravity are doing most of the work. And students can bend their knees. So if it's too much too soon, you can modify that easier than you can a skandasana. Much easier. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there any need to do, say, like active abduction before you do something more passive, like well, I guess that's not, I guess I'm thinking like something like what's a good example? A tree pose, or where you're kind of like using, you know, how we will extend the leg out to the side, you know, and we're using that muscle power, and it's very active abduction. Is it useful to do something like that before you do like a held skandasana, or do you not necessarily have to? Can you?
You don't have to, but it's very useful. Very, very useful. So yesterday was a good example. In class, I did Uparaga Hamsasana, so bird pose, right? Drawing the heel to the buttock. I had everybody focus on the squeezing of the heel to the buttock. So there was that activating of the hamstrings. It wasn't an active stretch. It was the opposite. It was an activation of the actual muscles, so that when we turned to the back of the mat and we went to do the stretch, those muscles were incredibly warm and ready to let go. Then I used active abduction, but active abduction, of engaging the butt muscles specifically and the outer thigh muscles in Kurukulasana before coming into Skandasana. So that's what you're talking about there. And what your students will notice is that they have more success because you've warmed the muscles you're specifically getting into at that point. Yeah.
And when
so you don't have to, but you can.
Got it. I missed class yesterday, unfortunately. But when you moved to the back of the mat and you stretched, did you use pyramid or?
Yeah. Well, I think, I'm pretty sure it was pyramid. Yeah. I'm fairly certain. Although I've been going in between pyramid and Ardha Hanuman like every other day. So back in the olden days when we always had like full 75 to 90 minutes, I would usually have pyramid and that Ardha Hanuman in the same class. Since we don't have that time anymore, I tend to alternate between, if Sean's done Ardha Hanuman in the beginning of class, the next day I'll do pyramid. And then if I've done,
would you say that's an easy way as a teacher to do this? So you could say, okay, every time I face them to the front of the mat, we're going to do activate the muscles. And every time I turn them to the back of the mat, I know I'm going to stretch that muscle, or vice versa. Would you say that's a great way to kind of log that in your mind?
Yeah.
And then that way when you see them turn, you know, okay, well, they're at the back of the mat. Today I was stretching. So what did I work at the front? Now let me stretch it at the back. Yes.
And that is an excellent way of organizing it in your mind. I mean, an excellent way. And I've had many classes where I actually, that was already in my head. Like, this place is my, this is my strengthen, this is my stretch. Okay. This is going to be my, you don't have to do with one single mat. It's always sagittal face forward or face back, and frontal faces the sides. But when you have two mats, then you can also organize your class according to that. So again, all sagittal moves will be on the forward facing mat, and all frontal moves and horizontal moves will be on the transverse mat. So yeah, that's a great way of organizing it. Yeah. All right, so we're going to come back to these ranges of motion more here in a moment, but I want to kind of skip down to what are known as stable zones, because these are areas where your students or yourself are more likely to have injuries and destabilization. That's what injuries are. Injuries are caused by a destabilization. That's just a very simple way of understanding it. So stable zones mean that you need these areas to be more strong than flexible. And you can see by this image, the foot is a stable zone. So when we start our class standing on 2 feet, we do this for 2 reasons. One is to actually push the energy up into the body, because, and you may notice this more in the morning when you first wake up than in the middle of the day when you might be doing yoga. But when you initially stand onto your feet in the morning, have you guys ever noticed that kind of like surge? You might be sleepy, but you're less sleepy standing than you are lying down. And a part of it is psychological, yes. If you're in your bed, there is something, and it makes me laugh because one of my Ayurvedic teachers called it the bed pleasures And we're not talking sexy bed pleasures. We're just talking, gosh, this is such a comfortable place. This is where I go to rest. This is where I go to sleep. So there's that psychological part, but there is also a physical part that once we step onto our 2 feet, energy is pushed up into the body. So one of the reasons we start standing is for that intention right there. But then in addition to starting standing in our classes, we also do that rocking motion from heel to toe. And we do that because you have in your feet, just like your pelvic floor and just like your shoulder girdle, you have this stable zone. And there's 4 key points to it. You have the heel of your foot, so I'll use my hand. You have the heel of your foot. You have the knife edge of your foot just opposite of the arch. And then you have the ball of the foot that has 2 key points of its own. One on what's known as the lateral edge, the outer edge, and one on the medial edge, which is the inner edge. And these 4 key points need to be active and pressing into the floor for every standing pose you do, every standing pose. And if we don't, then again, the stability above the feet is going to be lessened. And we run the risk too of this stable zone actually destabilizing it. There's an excellent body worker in Georgia that I took my whole family to. And she doesn't like to call herself a chiropractor. She is licensed as a chiropractor, but she works with athletes. And what she has found, she was an athlete herself, is that most of our structural misalignments occur because of 1 or 2, well, I'll take that back. One of the 3 main stability zones become destabilized. So with regards to the knees can be related up to the hips, which we're going to see here in a minute, and not the hips as in the ball and socket joint, but the hips as in what we think of the hips, the pelvic girdle. Or it can be the feet. And in the feet, you have the juncture of your shin bones with the talus, which is a triangular bone in the center of your foot, can become dislocated, for lack of a better term. And when this happens, this is where knee problems can occur, knee dislocation can occur, and it's all because of this one tiny bone in the very center of your foot. So if we activate these 4 key points, we strengthen the foot and prevent this destabilization of a bone that really sits somewhere in between all 4 of them. So that's the first stable zone. You'll notice that the ankles are mobile. They are mobile, but they're not a ball and socket joint the way your hip and shoulder are. So we're going to talk about how they're capable of doing 6 ranges of motion, but not 6 ranges of motion the way the shoulder can circle around or the hip can circle around. But a lot of your students are going to come in, and because they wear high heels or they wear shoes that kind of squish their feet into a tiny point, or because they are runners or cyclists or have twisted their ankle just walking down the street, they're going to have incredibly tight, potentially calcified ankles. And calcified because of scar tissue. So we got to get those ankles working. That's why in asana like malasana, garland posture, or in skandasana, I tell people, if your heel is lifted, that's fine, but do try to press it toward the ground. You can use a towel or something rolled up under it if you have pain when you stretch it, but it is better if you don't have pain to actually stretch the ankle. Just mindfully, always mindfully. The next zone is the knee. You'll notice again that it's stable. That's because the knees are not meant to be mobile. They're hinge joints. They're meant to open and close, just like a door. But as we're going to see later, and you've probably encountered this either with yourself or with students, it is possible to stress the knee on the outside, the inside, or like lateral, medial, or even inside the knee itself. And there are ways that we can keep our students safe in class to prevent that from happening in class, but you can't do anything for them once they leave the room. So you have to do what you can in the present moment, give it strength, don't over mobilize it. That means don't force poses like virasana. Don't force poses like pigeon or lotus, right? Next is the hip. What is really the hip here, all right? Most of us, when we put our hands on what we call our hips, we're putting our hands on our pelvis. So that's where the confusion comes in. But here we have the thigh bone entering into the pelvis. This is the actual hip, and this is a mobile zone. The hip itself is mobile. It's a ball and socket joint, so it can move in a beautiful circle. But then you'll notice here, this big yellow stable zone, and that's your pelvic girdle. Your pelvis and your iliosacral region need to stay stable. And like your foot, they have 7 key points that we talk about all the time in class, but I fully recognize, because there are 7 key points, that you might hear the first 1 or 2, if I'm lucky, the 3rd. And that's why, as a teacher, I'll typically pick out of the 7, the ones I feel people are going to resonate with the most and get the most out of. But there are those occasions where I actually blah, blah, blah for the full 7. So there's your neck stable zone. As far as the spine is concerned, you'll notice for the most part, it's all supposed to be mobile. That means, and yeah, I get it, sometimes the lumbar is actually lumped into the stable zone. It's not so much that you want to make it hypermobile, but you need to move it in all possible directions. And that goes for the entire spine. I did ask my physical therapist about this because I had never seen the cervical spine as being listed as a stable zone. She said no, that this does not need to be a stable zone. The only thing I would caution with regards to the neck is this. The vertebrae are much smaller. They're not meant to bear weight the way the rest of the spine is meant to bear weight. So when doing neck stretches, you do want to be mindful that this is a very mobile zone already, and overstretching is not necessary. But also be mindful that when bearing weight on the head, as in things like headstand, you've got to be super mindful about how you cue the arms. The arms are necessary. Until you can manipulate your own value, which if we get time, we'll talk about a little bit. So you can manipulate your own value, you're not going to be doing a hands-free headstand. You're going to encourage your students to grip with their fingertips if they're in tripod, or push down with their forearms if they're in bound. That's really important. So while I don't consider this a stable zone, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be a little more cautious when working with the neck. Now, what is a stable zone for sure, is the scapular region. The scapula, your shoulder bones, the wings, if you will, these should remain stable. Of course, I've got connection is unstable. My internet connection's unstable, but my scapula are incredibly stable. How do we stabilize them? We find their natural position. The natural position is to draw back and drop them down. The reason why this is a really important area for us to teach our students is not just because it should be stable, but because the go-to for the majority of people now is rounding themselves forward and creating kyphosis, which is an over-rounding of the upper back, the thoracic spine specifically. But what happens with this over-rounding is the scapula migrate away from one another, or they protract. So there are a lot of things we can do in our class that are going to help to draw those shoulder blades back toward the center and keep them there, so that the shoulders as a whole are actually kept healthy and sound. All right. The arms are identical to the legs. So you can see just by the picture, your hands are just like your feet. That's why when we shift the weight into our hands for any kind of arm balance, you don't want to do the spider finger thing that I see going around on the internet. That's just going to cause all kinds of problems. You want to actually keep the arch of your hand. Yes, a tiny arch of your hand. The image I always use is like a piece of paper rolled 3 times. If it can't be slid underneath, then you've collapsed. No different than you would collapse in the arch of your feet. Then you want to grip with each fingertip. So think of the fingertips as all right. I am back.
Yay.
All right.
Can I ask a quick question about the shoulders?
Absolutely. Please, by all means.
I was just thinking about how in our arm balances, like crow pose, for example, we do have this like rounded upper back, and as you engage there, you want to round away rather than thinking about drawing the shoulder blades back and down. Does that make sense? Like if this is when they're stable, drawn back and down, is it okay because we're so active that they're rounded?
So what you're going to have to do with that is when you actually go to lift up, you're going to have to draw those shoulders down. And what's going to happen when they're dropped down is there is going to be some engagement that not only pulls them down, but also pulls them slightly toward the midline. But we're not talking about like full on retraction. They're really going to be sitting more like right here on the back. All right. Full on retraction is a little bit of, that's more therapeutic than anything. So when we say draw them back, we don't want to think of necessarily squeezing them together. Squeezing them together is necessary for good posture. But when we're doing an arm balance, that won't be possible, and it can actually cause discomfort. So just to feel the shoulders actually drop down is going to be far more important. And that's why we want to cue that the students draw the chest forward, chin forward and up, and resist the urge to drop the chin down. Because that is, if you watch your students, or even watch yourself, when we try to do an arm balance for the first time, it's kind of like catching a really fast ball coming at your head. You tend to drop your gaze, you drop your head down, when that's the worst thing you could do because the ball could then just hit you and you have no hope of catching it. It's the same thing with an arm balance. You've got to think of drawing the chest forward, chin slightly lifted, and eyes looking up. Don't try to look down at the floor to protect yourself. Your protection comes from leaning, looking, and lifting from there. But yeah, so yes, it looks like we're rounded, but in this case, it's not rounded with like the shoulders drawing up toward the ears. You're really rounding more the spine than anything.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We need to think on that. I feel like,
yeah,
like in a plank pose, for example, if you cued, I feel like if I cued people to drop their shoulders, away from their ears and not to be squeezing them up, they would like collapse through their shoulders. So that makes sense. And have their shoulder blades kind of doing that, like pinching a penny thing, but in a harmful way. Where you're just losing the stability of the back instead of pressing away. But that's helpful.
I thought with plank though, you need a rounding. With plank, you do want to push up, and so the scapula do move apart because you want that broad base, right?
You have to be careful. There's a happy middle ground between those two places, and this is really difficult to find. And I had a woman, it was actually in my UNM course here, where she came over and out of all the people in the room, she's like, oh my goodness, you have too much. You're pushing up too much. Your head needs to be the highest point. Your chest needs to be drawn forward. And that's going to draw those scapula bones slightly in. But that doesn't mean that you're going to, because the pinching the penny can be dangerous, but so can pressing all the way up through that middle upper back. And it's interesting because like Sean in particular, I had to work with him the other day because he will press up so much because kyphosis runs in his family as it is. It's a weak space for him. He'll push up so much, his upper back is higher than his head. Not because he's dropping his chin, but because he's incredibly strong in his chest muscles. And I think his rhomboids are weak. So at that point, you're starting to stretch the rhomboids, which are the stabilizers or some of the stabilizers for the scapula. So you have to think, again, of drawing the shoulders down, leaning forward, and there's this grip with the fingertips that kind of helps you to find that middle point between drawing scapula all the way together or separating them all the way apart and rounding. So there is a happy balance, and I would encourage you to actually play with that and see if you can find it. Maybe we'll work on that a little bit in class tomorrow if I can remember, because it's a feeling thing. It's not always visible from the outside. What is visible is when someone's doing it totally wrong. Like when they've got the sway back or when they've got the arched cat back. Both of those are going to be not correct, right? Yeah. There's a happy median. Go for it, Neela.
Okay, so coming from a practitioner's point, I have not been able to get to anything with the handstand at all. So I'm wondering, so the weakness, is it in the shoulder or is it in the hip flexion not being there? Because I don't feel light.
Don't
I
feel
try to-
like this is totally normal. And it could be a combination of all of those things, because a lot goes on when you're trying to get up into the air, and a lot goes on, my God. So flexibility, first off, is a factor. I've seen very inflexible people be able to get into handstand, but it's a very forced motion. So it's not graceful, it's not light. It's more like I can throw myself in there and I'm strong enough to catch myself. Not the ideal way to do it. So there does need to be some flexibility. But let's talk about the strength aspect. The strength aspect actually starts at the hands. So there is this gripping mechanism again that we have to employ. Then you have to think of pushing your hands into the floor, like actually as if, and this was the imagination I had to have in the beginning, as if you could push the floor down away from you. Then there's the lean, and this is where most people struggle, because when you lean forward, the tendency is then to collapse the chest forward, to pinch the scapula bones together actually. And what needs to happen is the shoulders need to move down, but interestingly enough, the scapula actually elevate. The scapula elevate. Doesn't mean the shoulders go up around the ears. It means that when you're pushing down and you're imagining pushing the floor down away from you and you're leaning forward, as soon as you have that in place, the scapula will elevate up. Then it's a matter of reaching the tail for the air. And this is where that flexibility comes back in, because if you can't tilt the pelvis forward enough to lift that tail as high as possible, you are going to feel really heavy. But over time, I can promise you, at the very least, finding that grip with your fingertips, finding that placement of pushing the hands into the floor and that leaning forward, you'll eventually get more confident, and that will offset some of the flexibility issues. Although the flexibility will also come in that same span of time. But it does take time. And I kind of miss teaching people back when I couldn't do it. Because when I couldn't do it, we were voracious. We all just practiced it together over and over and over and over again. And then one day it happened, and it was awesome. And I love that it happened, because it is a resting period for me while you guys are working hard, heel kicking your butt over and over and over again. I'm just chilling. I am totally calm and relaxed. But the problem is I'm not suffering along with you. And I am a big fan of teachers, feeling the plight that their students are going through. But I have been there, and I do know that it feels impossible. It feels impossible. But the very fact that I was able to achieve it means that it's totally possible. Because I am by no means exceptional when it comes to the human physique. I am, by all standards, I'm supposed to be, well, I don't even know what I'm supposed to be. My parents wanted me to be a lawyer, like Mita. But I didn't want to sit enough. I wanted to move, and I wanted to feel movement. And that's led me to where I am now. But I can tell you that while I like to move, I'm not that good at it, and I'm not super graceful. And it took me a long time to learn grace in that particular. So just don't give up. Do know that these stable zones will be your best friends. Hands first in the case of handstand. Yeah. All right, so the stability of the pelvis, I've gone over this with you guys so much, and I know maybe to the point where you're like, okay, you can stop talking now. But the stability of the pelvic floor is the quintessential for everything, even our handstand, like what we were talking about. Because remember how I said reach that tail into the air? You're reaching the tail, but you're not just reaching the tail. You're also doing this number 2 all the way through number 7. And that's why I have you guys exhale to lift yourself off, because it's during that exhale that the lower abdominal muscles are going to fully engage and carry the rest of this lock, if you will, into place. So just really, really quick, because I know that this is review for you guys. You'll notice number 1, that during forward bends, like our downward facing dog, right? During forward bends, you think of tipping the pelvis forward. That means your 2 iliac crests, your hip points, what we call hip points, are moving forward, and your tail is moving back. or your two sit bones are moving back. That's during all forward bends. So any flexion at your hips. During all back bends, it's the opposite. You're thinking of tucking the pelvis so that your iliac crests, your hip points, are actually moving back, and your sit bones or tail are moving forward. And it doesn't stop there. This is why tucks and tilts get a bad name, because if that's all you're doing and you're not fully engaging number 2 through number 7, you can weaken the low back or make it too tight. So that's why we don't just simply say tuck, although sometimes we might, because it is the one audible cue that students hear and immediately respond. I mean, you can watch a whole room of people. It's amazing. You say tuck, they tuck. You say tilt, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, because they don't really understand that as much. But nevertheless, giving them 2 through 7 is beneficial every so often. Don't do it too much, because they will start drowning you out if it doesn't make sense to them. So the second is going to be engaging the interischial muscles together. So it sits between the two sit bones. Your sit bones are called the ischial tuberosities. Then engage your urethral and anal sphincters. Sometimes I refer to these as the gates of your pelvic floor. That's one way of looking at it. But there's really more than just these 2 gates. There's technically 3. It's just that these 2 gates are the easiest to find. The third gate sits between those 2. So for women, it's very obvious. It's the vaginal opening. For men, it's less obvious, but if they didn't have their pants on and they were looking in the mirror, they would see their testicles left. Because the same opening that women have, that is the vaginal canal, men have where their testicles actually drop. I think it's at puberty, but I really don't know. So I'm not going to get into that. But anyway, if they engage that space, they actually lift. So there is a third gate, but not one that I have mentioned here. All right. And I also don't cue it very often. You'll never hear me say engage your vaginal opening. That would be weird. Sometimes I do say engage your perineum, but this is a name that not everybody's familiar with. So again, anal urethral sphincters, or the gates of the pelvic floor. This people know. Next, and it's specifically on exhalation, engaging the transverse abdominis. So the transverse abdominis wrap around the lower portion of your abdominals. They are, or your abdomen, they are deeper than your rectus abdominis. And sometimes they're referred to as the corset, because this is what ultimately cinches you in. So you want to exhale, think of these 2 points drawing toward one another. Then draw navel to pubic bone. So navel to pubic bone. It can also be cued pubic bone to navel. The reason why I have navel to pubic bone here is muscles will always contract to their point of origin. Your rectus abdominis originate at your pubis symphysis, your pubic bone. Right? So that means that the muscle fibers are going to contract down. But because we have a tuck that initiated this whole process, I will often cue to think of drawing pubic bone to navel. And that is why, because you want to carry that tuck all the way through the front part of the body. Like now you're in a full body corset that zips. All right. Zips doesn't tie. Tying is behind you. It's too difficult. Then draw lowest ribs to hip points. And again, the reason why it's cued low ribs down is because this is the direction of the muscle fiber, but it's a little bit easier from the tucking standpoint to think of the hip or the hip points drawing up to the lowest ribs. All right, so just a recap on all of this, and then we'll start getting into the more specific complaints that students may have and how you can correct them or at least help them. Because let's just face it, we're not physical therapists, so our hands are tied with how intimate we can get with our students, as far as intimate understanding what they're going through and intimate as far as touching them. Just as a recap, again, when we're working with our spine, we do lateral flexion, sometimes called lateral extension, side bend, side bend. Then we do back bend, which is extension. Then we do flexion. And flexion of the spine is not the same as flexion of the hip. Flexion of the spine is when you round the spine. And in this case, you know what really happens? The vertebrae actually compress. That's what happens. They compress forward because they sit open anteriorly. So if like the anterior is the front side of your body. So when we say that they're open anteriorly, they're open to the front side of your body. When you forward bend, they're closed shut. This is why forward flexing can be very calming if you don't have conditions that would be contraindicated by it, which we'll talk about here in a moment. Because herniated discs, you do not forward flex the spine. So flexion here is actually letting the spine round a bit. Then twisting. With regards to the shoulders and the hips, so that means shoulder joint and hip joint, we have flexion, extension, abduction, moving away from midline, adduction, moving toward the midline and even maybe crossing it, and then twisting. And twisting again is going to be external rotation, internal rotation. Okay. This is just an image of the pelvis and pelvic floor so that for those of you who are more visual, when we talk about our engagements again, we think of engaging the muscles back to front, front to back. Then we think of engaging side to side here. Then we engage the infinity sign, which is ultimately the gates of the pelvic floor. And then we move into the low abdomen. And this is the female pelvic floor. The male pelvic floor doesn't look too terribly different. It's less round, it's less oval. And obviously it doesn't have a vaginal canal, but beyond that, they're very similar. Okay, let's move on. The structural guidelines for all students, I'll let you guys actually read these on your own so I can move into the bigger issues, if you will. These are the structural guidelines I give in all my teacher training manuals. They are always the same. They are the most important. If you remember these for yourself or you remember these for your students, you can stave off any injuries in your yoga classroom, any injuries that are within your power to prevent. Because there are some injuries that you cannot prevent, like if someone comes into your class hung over and hasn't eaten breakfast and started menstruating and decides to do a 95-degree hot class, they're probably going to faint. And there's nothing you can do about that. Just know there are some things you can't prevent. But the things we can, we should. So in this case, remember these guidelines. They're not hard. They're not hard to remember. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. This is also in always my teacher trainings. It talks about knowing, well, your own level of practice, but also the level of practice that your students may be in. Because it has nothing to do with how long they've practiced yoga. It has everything to do with their body and their capabilities. Oh, and their mind. Because some people are not open-minded. So no matter how capable they are, if you present them with something that is, whoa, then they're going to react with, whoa, and never come back. And again, there's nothing you could have done there. You were trying to open their horizons. Some people aren't ready for that. And I did. I had a girl here in Albuquerque. She was amazing. Her practice was so advanced, but she introduced herself to me as someone who had, a little experience. And I'm looking at her. She could do anything at all. She goes into headstand like it's nothing. After class, she says to me, no one tells me to do a handstand. And so I didn't tell you to. I just encouraged it. She said, yeah, but that's scary. I said, yeah, but you did it. And you did it with confidence, I thought, because you didn't shake. She said, yeah, I don't like being in uncomfortable situations. And I'm like, yeah, no one really does. But how you handle those uncomfortable situations are really important. She never came back. But then you have to smile, because again, what can you do? What can you do? All right. Okay, so I'm going to skip through all that. All right, common terms, because I've been throwing them out there, and really this would be good in the very beginning. Again, anterior means front, posterior means back, right? Superior means above, inferior means below. So if we're talking about, again, our planes of movement, anterior, posterior are going to be related to your frontal plane, right? Anterior front, posterior back. Superior, inferior are going to be related to your horizontal plane. It's going to be all about twisting the upper, the superior part related to the inferior part. And medial lateral will also relate to your frontal plane. Medial is toward the midline. Anything toward the midline is medial. And lateral is anything away from the midline. Superficial versus deep. Superficial muscles are the pretty muscles that everybody sees, but the deep muscles are the ones that are most important. There are stabilizing muscles. So pelvic floor muscles are examples, although we do have superficial and deep pelvic floor muscles. But still, those superficial muscles, those are the ones everyone looks to achieve strength with. It's the deep ones that yoga ends up working with the most. Again, flexion extension, we have beaten that over and over again. You guys know this very well. Adduction, abduction, and we've talked about those. Medial rotation, lateral rotation. It's just a fancier way of saying internal, medial, means moving in toward the midline, and then external, lateral, moving away from the midline. Elevation is when the scapula, if you think of anyway, with regards to the scapula, elevation is when the scapula bones move up, and depression is when they move down, although I rarely use the word depression in the class. It just doesn't work out well. Protraction is when your scapula move out. Retraction is when you move them together. Then supination and pronation, we don't use these very often, but you will hear them used, especially if you work with a physical therapist or if you ask your students, you know, what their physical therapist may have said their condition was really related to. If you think of your feet, supination is rolling to the outer edges. Pronation, is rolling toward the arches. All right, supination, pronation. You'll also hear inversion, eversion, but I'm not, you'll never see that in here. All right, I've also given you, Amanda and Emily know very well by now, I go overboard with information. So I've given you, okay, sorry, hold on one second. I've given you more information than you could possibly need. So I'm gonna skip over types of muscle contractions, just like that. Your type of muscles, I'm gonna skip over those too, although this is helpful information. I would highly recommend reading it in your free time if you have it. I will highlight here reciprocal inhibition is a little bit of, we've talked about this quite a bit actually. It's one way of activating muscles that in the effort of lengthening muscles. But in this case, it's very different from the way we've been talking about. This is if you activate the agonist muscle to lengthen the antagonist muscle. So what does that mean? If your leg is straight because your quadriceps allow it to straighten. If the leg is bent, it's because your hamstrings draw the leg to bend. So if you're in a pyramid pose, Parshavottanasana, let's just say, and you engage your quadriceps, like you really squeeze them, this is going to cause the hamstrings to let go, all right? So this is the idea of reciprocal inhibition. You engage one side of a body part to help lengthen the opposite side. Okay, that's all I'm gonna highlight there. Important qualities of flexibility. We've actually already kind of played on this because Emily had asked about it early on with regards to using active stretching prior to passive stretching. This is an excellent way of preventing injuries in your students because it introduces them to not necessarily their honest flexibility, but it introduces the muscles that are necessary in performing a stretch. So if you're doing abduction, you're feeling the muscles necessary, so active abduction, the muscles necessary to get that body part in place. And then when you do a more passive or even passive active variation of this, then it's easier. So I've put all of that here in writing. Static, active, ideal for preparing. Passive stretches mean gravity and body work does most of the work. These are gonna produce the most results with regards to flexibility. And then static, passive, active, it's best practiced after a passive stretch. And hello there, Liz. After a passive stretch in the same range of motion. So again, the ideal order here would be active stretch, passive, active stretch. And tomorrow in class, I'll highlight that as well. Okay.
Just an example of a passive active stretch. I remember this, but I'm trying to right now.
Absolutely. No, you're totally fine. Okay, so a good example that I like to give is standing forward bend is passive, right? Navasana, seated forward bend, is totally active. It's the same exact flexion at the hips, except when you're seated and you're working against gravity, you don't go as deep. Passive active would be if you got the hands involved. So you had some additional body part applying force against gravity. So in this case, it would be the hands. Yeah. Does that help? So it would be Ubhaya Padangusthasana, I believe is the name for that. Maybe we'll do that in tomorrow's class.
So basically you would want, ideally, to have made sure you had done that forward fold before you did it. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, because it's interesting, like Uttita Hasta Padangusthasana, right? Big toe hold, extended hand to big toe hold, is difficult to do if you haven't had some kind of forward flexion. But yet teachers will teach it all the time without any kind of asymmetrical forward flexion beforehand. So I always try, you'll notice if I'm gonna do that pose, I'll usually have pyramid at the front of the mat. So over, let's just say the left leg. Then I might turn to the back of the mat, drag that left leg forward and up, and then grab the big toe and extend it. So I had pyramid for the left leg at the front, and now I've got big toe hold for that left leg at the back of the mat. And it works out beautifully because you don't have to have a lot of vinyasa. There's literally one turn and you're there. You don't need to switch your legs. The leg you need is right there behind you. You just drag it forward and up. Fantastic. So I've given you subtle body anatomy. We don't have near enough time. 90 minutes is not enough time to go through, what is this? I can't remember if it's 15 or 17 pages. But what I want to point out with this is that your students walked into your room, or if they're in a wheelchair, they wheeled into your room. If they've got crutches, they use their crutches to get into your room. One way or the other, they're in front of you, their eyes are blinking, and they're breathing. That means they have vayu. They're alive. And each of these vayu are related to different bodily processes where they may have issues. So Vyana vayu is related to the heart and lungs. Asthmatics, people with circulatory issues, they're going to have potential deficiency or excess of Vyana vayu. Udana vayu is in the throat. People who commonly get hiccups or who have issues speaking, whether it's an emotional issue of not being able to speak because they've gotten in trouble for speaking their mind too many times, so they no longer speak, or whether it's a speech impediment they were actually born with. This is Udana vayu. Intelligence is also related to this. So people who have either too much, like too many ideas, not enough cohesion, or people who can't quite penetrate the cohesion to get to the ideas. This is Udana vayu. Prana vayu. Prana vayu is also related to the head, but this is more specific to, no, it's definitely specific to the head. Less related to the throat and speech, more related simply to intuition and inner guidance. Then Samana vayu is related to peristaltic movement throughout the body. So people who have issues with constipation, who have issues with food actually getting stuck in the esophagus and not properly moving through, this can be an issue. It's usually related back to dryness, which again would cause Samana vayu to be either depleted or overactive. And then last but not least, and this is all very quick, you guys, we could spend an hour just on the vayus. Apana vayu is related to downward moving energy. Its presence is in the pelvic cavity. So for someone who has sacroiliac dysfunction, then this can be an excess of apana, or it could be a deficiency of apana, depending upon many other factors. But I wanted you guys to have these available to you because when you practice yoga, you're impacting directly your vital life force. And your vital life force is not just in and out breath. It's all 5 of these particular guttis, if you will, these movements throughout the body. So you have them now. You can study them, read them, and any questions you have about them, direct them my way. I love having conversations about the vayu. I also included Marma. Of course, we don't have time to talk about that because I'm trying to scoot to the end here, but I do want to point out that Marma is how we impact the vital life force with our asana. Because Marma are the sensitive zones on the body which carry prana to the subtle body and direct prana from the subtle body to the physical body. So think of it like the subway system of prana, connecting the physical body and the subtle body. They are pressure points that can be felt, and we have worked with them quite a bit in class. When your students come in with issues related to lower half of the body, you can typically favor asana, which impact these points, and it will encourage blood flow and remove stagnicity in the areas where they may be having trouble. All right, same thing goes for areas of the upper body. Right? Yes, you can say that there's a point on your foot that's related back to your heart, but more often than not, the marmani of the legs, the pressure points on the legs, are going to be related to the lower half of your body. Pressure points of your arms are going to be related to the upper part of your body. And then pressure points on your torso are going to be related back to their own specific visceral organs. So you don't have to make it too complicated. When it comes to marmani, it's a lot simpler than learning the Oriental medicine system, the Chinese medical system. This is a nice review for those of you who have done teacher training before here, where it is any kind of twisting unlocks energy that may be either dormant or stagnant in the body. Extension of any kind, be it lateral extension or back extension, or just extension of any body part, is going to actually release or expand energy. Flexion of any kind is going to calm energy, and backbending of any kind is going to stimulate. And backbends in particular will stimulate all marma energy, and this is why it's important that we compensate our backbends with forward bends. I gave you additional information with regards to the dosha, and now we finally made it to the content I wanted to get to. Okay, you guys, here we go. So, common complaint. Yes, Neela, go for it. No, please, ask.
So, this breathing in and breathing out, how does that impact that energy? So I know that you cue all the breathing in and breathing out, but is there some signs, some pattern to when to breathe in and when to breathe out to manage this energy?
This is an excellent question, and this is perfect because this is actually where we're getting into here as well. So most people, when they breathe, they breathe paradoxically. They inhale and they draw their navel back, and they exhale and they let the abdomen kind of relax. And that's if they're even thinking about it. So they're usually not thinking about it. So the times you should inhale are during any times you're trying to expand out. And you want to exhale anytime you're trying to contract inward. So in times where you're really needing that muscular power, that strength, you're going to want to use an exhale. You're going to want to create that contraction toward the midline. Anytime you want to create more lightness, you're going to take a big breath in and fill yourself like a balloon. Because you're building prana at that point. You're increasing vata. During exhale, you're actually decreasing vata because your life force has left your body. Not in a bad way, but it's a good detox. So, but this also increases kapha. And when we increase kapha, we actually get strong, stable. So when we want to go into an arm balance, we use an exhale to do that. Now, there are some people that will cue to inhale on liftoff, and the reason they do that is for the reason I just gave. You inflate like a balloon. The problem is, again, it would be a good idea to set yourself up with that exhale, then inhale, inflate once you get there to create that lightness. Because if you don't produce the stability first, you're going to have a difficult time potentially getting into it. But yeah, always inhale to expand and then exhale to contract. Yeah. And that's why I cue it. Well, that's one of the reasons. Another reason, and you guys will actually see this when you read through this, is a lot of injuries occur because of a lack of mindfulness, just general lack of mindfulness. Because most injuries don't happen when we're doing something exciting. They happen when we're doing something normal and we're not thinking about it. So if we can get our students to become mindful about their breath, there's a higher likelihood we can get them to be mindful about how they step with their feet or how they plant their hands. So that's the first step. It's wild how little we know about our bodies. It's just wild to me. So a common complaint you get from students, thyroid. Low thyroid, more common than hyperthyroid, but both occur. So you could probably guess, just based on its location, anything we do with our neck is going to benefit thyroid. It's going to increase blood circulation there, all right? But knowing also from a MARMA standpoint that twisting unlocks stagnicity, that extension actually releases, that flexion calms, and really going through flexion and extension. Let me move my hair here. The dangers of wearing my hair down. There we go. That contracting and expanding also helps to pump fresh blood and oxygen to that particular, in this case, gland. The same thing occurs with the other organs, though, in your entire abdominal region. So people coming in, and they're not usually, I worked in a health food store for a while, so I got a lot of people coming in with liver complaints, very common. Your students aren't typically gonna come in with liver complaints, but you can see the ones who probably have them. People with liver conditions usually have more adipose tissue around the abdominal region, right? More apple-shaped. These people also tend to be more pitta predominant, more fire related. So doing things to release heat from the liver, release heat from the spleen are going to be very beneficial. How about releasing heat from the stomach, right? So I wanted you guys to have this because when you're working with the abdomen, even though most people are going to come to you with spinal ailments, you have to know that you have these glands and you have these organs that are constantly being twisted and flexed upon and extended. And so if we understand, again, that MARMA influence, then we can understand, at least from a subtle body perspective, how we can impact these organs and help our students overall feel more balanced when they leave the class. Yes, ma'am, go for it.
So I've been cueing, like when I do standing back bends, that people lead with their throat to the ceiling instead of letting their head drop completely back, because I see that a lot. And I know there's a nerve right there, because people will complain, oh, I'm dizzy. Well, I say, well, when you let the skull drop back, you're cutting off that nerve. So try to lead more with the throat and contract the back of the neck so you keep the curve. Is that, I mean, yeah, okay.
That last bit that you put with contracting the muscles of the back of the neck are super important, because that's where people are missing. They're not contracting those muscles. They're just literally, like you said, letting their skull drop.
Drop back. Because when you say look back, they immediately let the head literally drop back, and that puts that compression right there on that nerve.
So with Shakti Chalani Mudra, the contraction of the back of the neck, which is essentially what we're using, I mean, if we cued it, most students aren't using it, is exactly that. It's a contraction of the back side of the neck while maintaining a slight contraction of the front side of the neck as well, so that you, so that you're not.
Yeah, and that's what I try to find a good way to word that. So, because this needs to be lifted versus the chin just dropping back, like lift with the throat. And I feel like when you lift the throat, the back of the neck automatically wants to contract.
Yeah. Yeah, leading with the throat. Yeah, no, you're right. Leading with the throat or leading with the chin. Yep. Really smart. And that will prevent people from getting dizzy. Because you're right. Impingement in the cervical spine can make you incredibly dizzy. Yeah. And it's going to hurt, because that's another common complaint, is degeneration of the cervical spine.
Yeah.
Question. I think what Amanda just said was really helpful to me, because, you know, occasionally that whatever you were saying about just bending the head back happens. So when you engage those contract the neck muscle, do you feel a stretch in the sternum part of your?
You can, especially if you stretch the front side of the neck, because all the muscles of the neck originate at the clavicle. So all of these originate at the clavicle. So if you think of contracting the back side of the neck, even if you hold a little contraction in the front side of the neck, again, you can't contract both sides at the same time. So you're gonna get a nice deep stretch, and that will feel really good. Because when we stress breathe, these muscles become really tight. And all of us stress breathe at some point, especially if we do any kind of cardiovascular exercise. So, yeah, nice. Look at that, Amanda. You just changed Neela's night and tomorrow's practice for her. That was awesome. I love it. I gave some additional bullet points here with regards to, again, if people come in with asthma, or if they have heart conditions like low blood pressure, high blood pressure, just always cue with regards to pranayama to go slow. Go slow, don't feel like you have to do rapid breathing. Maybe better to favor Soham pranayama, which is a cue I give a lot in class, especially because I recognize that the majority of people probably have one of those three things I just said. Asthma, even if it's not severe, high blood pressure, or low blood pressure. Most, not all. As far as digestive complaints are concerned, again, students aren't always going to come in and tell you, and more often than not, they're not unless they just had some kind of abdominal surgery that was related to their digestive system. But knowing that so many people do have complaints, including perhaps even yourself at times, I just gave you some encouragements if a student ever does come to you. So, giving time between eating and doing yoga, because we're going to be pressing on all these organs. The last thing you want is to have had a nice big meal prior to coming to class. This could lead to discomfort and vomiting. Another thing is I did point out that there's disagreement with regards to don't drink during class. I say don't be dogmatic. If you're in a 95-degree hot room, you can't tell your students not to drink. They could become dehydrated. But even in a non-heated room, students may be sweaters and they could become dehydrated, especially if you're doing a lot of pranayama. So while it's not ideal to drink during yoga because it is still ingesting, you don't want to necessarily be dogmatic. Always explain to students pros and cons. If you're feeling dehydrated, better to drink water. If you're not feeling dehydrated, better to not drink water. That's it. And if you do drink water, maybe don't rush into your downward facing dog, because that water wants to go down and you're telling it to go up. And this is where confusion starts to occur. In addition to that, with regards to digestive, I know that some people understand this, some people don't. When twisting, best to twist right, then left, best. In a class, and I get this question all the time, sometimes we twist left and then right. And the reason being is whenever we're doing turns in our class, we will always twist in the direction we're going to turn. So if that means I've got left turns that have been planned, we're going to end up twisting to the left. Is it ideal? No. Energetically, yes. And that's where yoga is interesting, because it does straddle two different bodies. It straddles the subtle body and the physical body. So you have to determine in the moment, what's more important, the physical body or the subtle body. There is a way to satisfy both, and that would be your very first or maybe even your deepest twist. You go right, and then you twist left. But in your less deep twists, it's not going to harm your students by twisting left first, right? But when it comes to our turns, all side bends, all twists, if they're done in an asymmetrical fashion, they're always going to be done in the direction that you're going to be turning. This sends a signal to your students' subtle body where they're going. So it's less abrasive, because turns can be scary. They can be intimidating, but it'll feel very natural if you've already been twisting that direction, side bending that direction. With regards to kidney issues, I've had a lot of students come in with kidney stones. There's really not much you can do in a yoga class except tell them take as many breaks as they need. And if it starts to move and they need to leave, that they are more than welcome. Maybe even have them set up for the front of the room. Now, I did include here, however, that balasana can be very beneficial, child's pose, as can a supine position with the arms stretched over the head. And the reason arms stretched over the head is, let's say you're in a yoga class, but you've got a lot more to do in your day, all right? It's not late in the evening, or it could be late in the evening and you still have a lot ahead of you. When the arms are over the head, Udana Vayu, which we talked about up above, Udana Vayu is still able to move up. So you don't become sleepy, right? Apana is not allowed to move completely down at this point. So it's a good way of helping your students to regenerate, their adrenals to regenerate, which sit right on top of the kidneys. So if they have kidney issues, more than likely, they've got some adrenal stuff going on too. But giving them an opportunity and giving them permission to rest, and to rest in a manner that won't make them sleepy, could be very helpful. All right, we are almost to the end here, just based on time. But the muscles of respiration, this is, Nelia, something you had asked about, and it was an excellent question. It is important to understand how we breathe and why we breathe and how to breathe efficiently. So I've given you an image here that was incredibly helpful. I've also recommended 3-part breathing. 3-part breathing, Dirga pranayama, is really, really good, and it can be done with your hands assisting. So if you place, like for your students or for yourself, if you start with the hands at the low belly, specifically with the middle fingers touching over the navel, and make sure they're touching but not like pushing into each other. Have your students or yourself inhale, breathe out, and specifically into the belly, and feel those fingers separate. Then as you exhale, feel them come together. Then move the hands up to the ribs, and you can have the hands just placed on the ribs with, again, middle fingers touching right at the tip of the sternum, the bottom, the posterior tip of the sternum, or not posterior, sorry, inferior tip of the sternum. Inhale into the ribs and feel them separate and close in. And then you can come up to the chest and do the same thing with the middle fingers just below the clavicle. Inhale and exhale. Using the hands really helps students to, and yourself even, to feel when they're not fully breathing into the space. Because if the fingers never separate, you're not fully inhaling into these 3 parts. You can also have them put their hands on the sides of their ribs, because a lot of people will breathe forward really well, but they don't breathe out. Right? And breathing out is just as important. Right? Using all sides of your ribs. Something else that I included here, which I feel like is a great exercise to do, and you can do it with yourself, with your students, is this tool to stretch the diaphragm. Your diaphragm is a muscle. It relaxes on exhale, but there is a way to stretch it. And so if you do this, and just try it really quick, it's the neatest feeling in the whole wide world, or at least it's neat to me. If you exhale and feel your navel pull back, completely empty the lungs. Now hold the breath out and try to relax the abdominal muscles. Try to relax them forward while holding the breath out. And feel if you don't get a little tug up toward the diaphragm. Little tug. And then relax. How did you feel it at all? Like a little stretch? A little something? This is actually a good way to teach Uddiyana Bandha, because Uddiyana Bandha, the full Uddiyana Bandha, where you actually draw the entire stomach back and up, really hard for most people to do. But this is a good way of preparing them for it, because you are still retaining the breath on exhale. It's Bhaya Kumbhaka, so our external retention. But you're not, instead of drawing all those muscles back deeper, you're actually relaxing them forward, and then the diaphragm's being forced up more and more and more. It's pretty neat. So anyway, okay. We literally only got through this part. But you have so much information now that you can read and enjoy. And then if you have any questions, I'm here. I am here 100%. You can email me questions. We could always do another Zoom just like this, next 4-week cycle, and we could actually pick up from where we're leaving off here. So if you guys want to do that, just let me know. Or if you want to deepen on the topics we've already talked about, because we pretty much skimmed through a great deal of material. And as you can see, there's still a great deal left. And this is not exclusionary. These are just issues that I've had students come in that I've had to research for their sake, or issues I've had and had to research for my sake. I've included as much information as I could possibly type in a very short period of time. A lot of this is available in our teacher trainings and our teacher training manual. So I carry it with me everywhere. But before I shut down, because I respect that you guys, some of you are dealing with 8 o'clock at night right now, do you have any questions? Additional questions or clarification on questions you had asked earlier, and now you're like, I don't understand as much as I thought I did?
So for forward folds, let's say you were doing big toe hold. Naturally, you want to lift the tailbone because you're forward folding, and the hips are going to want to rotate that way anyway. Is it wrong to pull against the toes, straighten the arms, maybe a slight bend in the knees, and then try to tuck the pelvis? Now, I know that will be a lot of pull on the lower back if you try to keep the knees straight, but would it be wrong to cue it with knees slightly bent?
I think it could be useful from the standpoint of maybe stretching the low back for people who have a lot of tension. But definitely having the knees bent would be incredibly important.
Right, because once the legs go straight, then you've got a real deep pull on the lower back and the hamstrings trying to pull the pelvis, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And there's actually a condition in the spine that was coming up where herniation of the discs is very common because of weak abdominal muscles. And again, herniation of the discs occurs not during anything exciting. It's usually bending over and picking something up with a slight twist or of the spine, or not bending the knees when you lift something heavy. That's usually what happens. But because so many people have herniated discs before, when you round the lumbar spine, even slightly with a tuck during a forward bend, it can weaken that area. So we do have to be careful, but bending the knees would be that means of being careful. Because it is, the low back is tight, and rounding the low back is not inherently bad, but it is with straight legs. So smart with bent knees. Yeah, really good.
So like with child's pose, I mean, the spine is rounded, but the knees are bent, right?
Yeah. So, yeah. Same thing with cat pose, high back cat pose. Same thing. So yeah, rounding the spine, not inherently bad. Rounding the spine with straight legs, definitely got to be super cautious. But I think what you described with bent knees is fine. Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
You were talking earlier about forward bending being very bad if you do have a slipped disc. Is there, like, having your knees bent, does that help protect people?
It does.
I've never had a slipped disc, and I would hate to be like, bend your knees, it's fine, because I don't know if they should be forward bending even with the knees bent.
It's very difficult to do, and someone who has herniated discs more than once, they'll usually, I had a private client I actually worked with, and she herniated discs regularly. I mean, many signs that the things she was doing as hobbies were probably not good ideas for her, but she wanted yoga classes, and I told her they would actually be quite beneficial. So I favored more back bends than forward bends. But when I would have to forward bend, because let's just face it, there are very few transitions in yoga that don't involve some kind of flexion at the hip. So what you have to do is definitely bend the knees and flat back, all the way through. So leading with chest and leading with chin, and having blocks handy, because a lot of times that flat back is really hard to achieve if they have tight hamstrings. Yeah. So that's a good question. I have that in writing in this manual as well. So it's a part of the spine and torso section. Yeah. And the reason why I spent so much time, you guys, in the beginning with the information that I did give you is that that's the foundation of everything. Like those structural guidelines that I have written out for you, those can prevent a lot of injuries, and they can also help if students have injuries. And then the pelvic floor engagement is the foundation of every single alignment cue. It doesn't matter what you're doing, back bends, forward bends, twisting, arm balancing, leg balancing. The pelvic floor engagement is going to be essential, especially if you have sciatica, which is a really common issue that a lot of people have. I have that one listed in here as well. I've given you, and I've got it recorded, a protocol. It's a short protocol, but there are a lot of protocols for sciatica to relieve pressure on that nerve. But really what we want to do is we want to avoid re-injuring or causing it to flare up in class. And so again, best way you can avoid it, pelvic floor engagement. Because more often than not, sciatica is a destabilization of that sacroiliac region. And that can occur because of, and actually it was on this page that we were just finishing up with, it can occur because the pelvis is either lifted laterally or tilted anterior on one side versus the other side. It can also be because the sacrum is nutated or counter-nutated excessively. So all of that is in here, and it's in writing. So as you go through it, if you're like, wow, this is still super confusing, I did write it really quick, so I do apologize. I should have started it way sooner, but I didn't realize how in depth I was going to go with it until, I got 36 hours away from tonight. So, but yeah, that's why so much time was spent on ranges of motion again, and the necessity of structural alignment and the stable zones are really important. So now when you do asanas yourself, feel your feet, feel your pelvic floor, feel your hands, feel your scapula, and do know, again, with regards to the scapula, they naturally kind of sit off to the sides. They aren't naturally squeezing together like they could hold a pencil, but they also shouldn't be sliding off your rib cage, causing you to hunch forward. So in your mind, just always try to find what is neutral. It's the same thing really with your pelvis. To overtuck is just as dangerous as to overtilt with your pelvis. So we have to know the same thing applies to our scapula bones, and finding that happy medium is everything. It's everything for the stable zones of our body, and it's everything for our life. So good lessons to learn. Any other questions at all before we go?
Thank you. I was listening to everything. So
oh, you're the 404 number. Nice.
I'm the 404. Yeah, still, after not living in Atlanta since 2010. Yay. So I know anyone calling me on 404 is pretty much spam, so I don't answer. But yeah, so I've been listening, but I've been running around too. But Jesse's known me for a long time now, over 10 years, I guess. And I've had so many injuries in terms of broken ankle, cervical, landed on my head. I've got C3 herniation, all this stuff. And then I come to her, I said, my elbow hurts, my shoulder hurts, my wrist hurts, blah, blah, blah. And what's amazing is I think just sticking with this and listening to engagement, if you just engage, a lot of this stuff does just kind of go away. But the last one I sent to Jesse was I thought I had sciatica. I had something in my butt. It hurt really bad. Anytime I would lift my legs when we're lying on the ground and we're lifting our legs, I was like, oh, God. And then, I did a tennis ball and I did a lacrosse ball. And then yesterday, Sam put his thumb in my side and I just collapsed. I was like, oh, my God. And so I don't think it is sciatica. There's something else going on there, because I was hoping for a pop when we did our pelvis thing. I was like praying that just my pelvis is going to pop and I'm going to have this instant relief, and that just didn't happen. And so I think there is something on that side, though, going on, keeping everything super, super, super tight in there. But I just want to say thank you to Jesse and thank you all. But it was just one of those things where I was like, gosh, I have gone through so many injuries with you, so many, and just recurring and new ones, and it's the shoulders, and it's whatever. But shoulder doesn't hurt, elbow doesn't hurt, wrist doesn't hurt, butt kind of hurts now, ankle. And that's the thing. Anytime we're ever in our, oh God, why am I blanking? Because I had a mojito. Utkatasana, chair pose.
Yeah.
Right? when I'm in chair pose, I don't have the dorsal flexion anymore because of the broken ankle twice. And so I only go as far as I can go. So it's like, go deeper, deeper, deeper. And I'm like, this is where I am right now. And I was told, so here's a question, sorry to say, but I was told, okay, the right foot doesn't dorsal flexion, but the left foot does. Is it okay to then lift the heels to go deeper? Like, you know, lift one heel and then just say, okay, well, screw the right ankle. I'm going down my, you know, I'll lift the right ankle.
Do that, and then once you find that depth, the heel that you're lifting, if you try and obviously it probably won't go, but if then you actively try to press it down in that depth that you have, that would actually be a great mobilizer, even though there's only so much that can be done once bones have calcified. Even though there's only so much to be done, you know, just that extra pressing down. I mean, always listen to your body's pain response, but in that case, absolutely point the toes, get as low as you can, and then just actively press that one heel toward the ground, even though it may not go. That way, you know, you're not.
But it does remind. Yeah. It reminds me that since the right ankle doesn't flex and I'm doing everything, it's probably the cause of the right hip, of the right shoulder, of the right arm, of the right wrist. Like, it all cascades, and it just kind of goes up and down depending on what's going on. But stick with it.
And see, this is why I think, you know, because injuries, or I should say discomfort is either trickle down or trickle up. And so it is. If there's been an injury to a body, to a stable zone below, it's going to trickle up. If there's been an injury to a stable zone up above, it's going to trickle down. And all we can do is try to pull people back together. And the best ways to pull people back together are to focus on those stable zones. So again, the feet, the hands, the pelvic floor, and the scapular region. And really, that could end up being the game changer right there. Or at least bring them to a place where they can experience life a little bit more fully, even if the problems aren't totally gone. Because, you know, sometimes they're more difficult than just squeeze your pelvic floor shut. Sometimes. Yeah. Fair enough. All right, you guys. Well, after you get offline, if there's anything else that you can think of, please don't hesitate. I'm going to post this video, so if you want to go back and rewatch it. Okay, those are beautiful. I love those.